books and literature reading are a very big part of our life. I teach at the university, I'm a professor, and I make all of my students read novels and fiction to basically understand more about the being of a lawyer. If you take the Nuremberg trial and look at the best writing about it, some of it is non-fiction and some of it is fiction. Interestingly, actually, the best writing about Nuremberg is by women. The women who sat in the courtroom and watched what was going on were able to see things that the men, mostly journalists rather than novelists, did not see going on in the room. It's really fascinating. I'm thinking of three writers in particular who are remarkable raconteurs, both as novelists and as non-fiction writers. Rebecca West, Martha Gellhorn, and one who has fallen, if you like, off the pedestal and is generally not known. I'd be surprised if anyone knows her name, Janet Flanner. Janet Flanner was the Europe correspondent of the New Yorker magazine, and she would, letter from Europe came with every week's edition of the New Yorker, and she did quite a few letters from Nuremberg, and they're just rich and fantastic in ways that the male writing of that trial does not capture. They spot little exchanges, the raising of an eyebrow, the raising of a voice, the way Hermann Goering is described as looking like, the madam in a brothel. Ever since I've read that, I've never been able to get it out of my mind. That was actually what it looked like, And I think that literature and art, painting actually, help us to understand these processes and these proceedings. This is a big issue in my next book. I'm just finishing right now the third book. It's going to be a trilogy. I mean, the last colonies are sort of separate apart, but it's East-West, the Ratline, and the third one takes the story of two men. Augusto Pinochet, who you've probably all heard of, former president of Chile, and a man called Walter Rauff. Has anyone here heard of Walter Rauff? No. Walter Rauff was the man who invented and operated the mobile gas vans before they had Treblinka and Sobibor and Belzec and all these places. They had little vans which would go around the countryside gathering people in groups of 50 and gassing them to death. So that's Walter Rauff's project. Walter Rauff was a close friend of Otto Wächter. They worked together in Berlin in 1938 and then in Milan in 1943 and 1944. And I came across Rauff's name in a letter in the archive, the famous archive, sent to Otto Wächter in May 1949 from Damascus, Syria, to where Rauff has fled, telling Wächter, don't go to the Arab world, it's not a good place for Germans, they don't work very hard, they're disorganized, blah, blah, blah. Not ideal, not politically correct language today, but it's a long typed letter, quite well written. And I noticed this letter, and I asked myself, who is this person, Walter Rauff? I've never heard of him, but it rang a sort of vague bell. So I followed his trajectory. He leaves Damascus in 1949, end of 1949. He follows his own advice. He goes to South America, and he ends up in Quito, Ecuador, with his wife and 2 children. While he's in Quito, Ecuador, they make new friends, they make a new life, and they meet, he and his wife Edith meet a wonderful Chilean couple who say, you're in the wrong country, you should be in Chile, because we have lots of Germans in Chile and we like people who are like you, we feel warm towards you. So the family moves to Chile, and they move all the way to the south of Chile to a town called Punta Arenas in Patagonia. and they make a new life there, and there are ups and there are downs, and Ralph becomes the manager of a king crab cannery, putting the flesh of crabs into tins for export to South America and Europe. And life continues. And then, on the September the 11th, 1973, the other September the 11th, miracle of miracles, Ralph's friend from Chile, from Ecuador, from Quito, becomes president of Chile. It's Augusto Pinochet. They've been friends for all of this time. And all the rumors in Chile are that Ralph then went to work for Pinochet's secret intelligence service, the DINA, but there was no evidence at all. So I've spent a lot of the last 7 years looking for the evidence, if any, of what Ralph did with Pinochet. And that's what the next book will be about, the lives of the two men, which then moves into the arrest of Augusto Pinochet in London, in the case that I was involved in, on the question of whether he had immunity. But coming back to the starting point of this little anecdote, I remembered the name Ralph from somewhere, and I couldn't remember what it was until one day in Santiago, a friend of mine said, a poet, said, "You must have read Bruce Chatwin's In Patagonia." Ralph is chapter 96. Chatwin went to Patagonia, to Punta Arenas, in 1975. And in 1976, he writes his book, famous book, In Patagonia, one of the great travel books written. And Ralph becomes a character in the book. And Ralph then becomes a character 20 years later in two novels by Roberto Bolaño. Nights in Chile and Nazi Literature in the Americas features Walter Ralph. And all of a sudden, you begin to understand how the placing of a name of a character in a literary work contributes to the creation of a mythology in an entire community about the role of that person in that society. Just before I finish the anecdote, I will give you one more unbelievable coincidence. I got interested to know when and where did Chatwin write In Patagonia. It's a very famous book in England. I may not have travelled to Romania, but in Britain it's one of the great travel books. And it turned out that he wrote In Patagonia in 1976, between January and June, in a house he had rented in a small village in France called Bonnieux. And I was curious to know more, so I went to the archives at Oxford and found his original letters and moleskin diaries. Chatwin is famous as the person who made famous the moleskin diaries, the moleskin notebooks. Yeah. And with the wonderful archivist at the Bodleian, Richard Ovenden, we found all the documents, the materials, and I discovered that he wrote In Patagonia at number 12 Rue Droite in the village of Bonnieux. Number 12 Rue Droite in Bonnieux is precisely 140 meters from our little house in Bonnieux. And that also came up completely unexpectedly. How could it possibly be that later on there is also this curious connection?
And what your wife said about it?
Total nonsense, just bullshit, total bullshit. She's very tough, very tough.
But she loved the podcast, right?
She loved the podcast, and she loves the whole Ukrainian side of the story, since we're here to celebrate Ukraine. But she thinks I've become a bit obsessive about Ukraine, so she's very, very happy that I've headed off to South America.
I think we have 5 extra minutes. Okay, so let's finish with another decent man, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. At Nuremberg, it was the first time in human history that the leaders of the state were put on trial before an international court for crimes against humanity and genocide. The two new crimes that Lauterbach and Lemkin coined. 50 years after Nuremberg, the International Criminal Court was founded. You worked at the preamble, and you've been involved in many significant international cases. I mentioned Pinochet, Congo, Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Guantanamo, Rohingya. In 1999, the Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic was the first serving head of state to be indicted for crimes against humanity. And in March last year, ICC judges issue arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin, allegedly responsible for the war crime of unlawful deportation of population from occupied areas of Ukraine. You said that proving the crime of genocide is difficult. We don't expect Putin to come in the court soon, at least. But why is it so difficult to prove those crimes?
It's not difficult to prove all the crimes. I mean, what happened in 1945, it was a very significant moment. But before June 1945 and the meeting in London where the four Allied powers came together, there was only one international crime, war crimes, which had actually emerged in the middle of the 19th century from Russia. The first instrument is the Declaration of St. Petersburg of 1868, ironically enough. And in the 1890s and the 1900s, the Tsars were very supportive of developing war crimes law. But when they negotiated and drafted the Statute of Nuremberg, they needed more crimes. War crimes was not enough. And so they basically invented and then retrofitted these three new international crimes, which we still have today. Crimes against humanity, which is basically about harm to individuals, invented by Lauterbach. Genocide, which is about the destruction of groups, invented by Lemkin. And what in 1945 was called crimes against peace, today the crime of aggression. And the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction for three of the crimes committed on the territory, for three crimes that may be committed on the territory of Ukraine. War crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And it's pretty clear that war crimes have been perpetrated. I'm pretty clear also that crimes against humanity, I don't think you can describe Pinochet's, Putin's actions as genocide. There's been some genocidal rhetoric. They don't exist as a people, there's no such thing as a Ukrainian, but no acts, I think, of genocide as such, in the legal sense. That's very, very difficult to prove because of a series of cases which have set a very high threshold for proving the intention to destroy a group in whole or in part, which is how you prove genocide. But when Putin launched his war on Ukraine, 2 days later, the Financial Times got in touch with me. And again, this is, I suppose, it's a story of how literature and writing, I mean, I don't write fiction, I write what in Germany is called literary non-fiction, but how writing changes subsequent developments. So 2 days after the war begins, the editors of the Financial Times get in touch with me and say, could I write 700 words on Ukraine and international law? Why did they choose me? Because I'm an international lawyer, and because I've written about Ukraine, because I've spent a lot of time in Lviv, because the book East-West Street deals with Ukraine. And so I say yes, I will do that, and I think for about a day on what to write, and I end up focusing on the gap in the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. They can deal with war crimes, they can deal with crimes against humanity. If genocide happens, they can deal with that. They can't deal with the crime of aggression. And as with Nuremberg, the crime of aggression, for me, is the most significant of all the crimes, because if he hadn't invaded, none of the other crimes would have happened. The second reason it's significant is it's a leadership crime, the crime of aggression. It's the only crime that goes straight to the top table. And there's going to be no difficulty putting questions of immunity on one side, establishing the responsibility for the crime of aggression of Mr. Putin, Mr. Lavrov, Mr. Shoigu, probably 3 or 4 top military types, 3 or 4 top FSB types, and maybe some of the people who provided the finance to make this happen. The problem with war crimes and crimes against humanity is proving the role of a head of state is very, very difficult. And I had in mind, when I was thinking about what article to write, a scenario 5 years down the line, which may yet happen, in which half a dozen low-grade or middle-grade Russian types are hauled up before the International Criminal Court, but the people at the top table get off scot-free. That's not justice, that would be a terrible situation. Soldiers on the ground may have done terrible things, but they're not responsible for the totality of the horrors. That's Putin, Lavrov, and Shoigu, and these other characters. So I wanted to put the accent on that, and I proposed creating a special criminal tribunal for the crime of aggression, which had not happened since 1945. And it's not happened because the big powers have a common interest in keeping the crime of aggression off the table for various different reasons. So, you know what it's like, much better than me. You write an article, and over the next 24 hours, a small number, in my case, a very small number of people get in touch and say, terrific, or terrible, or I disagree, or whatever. This was completely different. Within 24 hours, I'd had hundreds of emails, and not just from people I knew or academics, from all over the world, and from former heads of government and heads of state, including 2 in the United Kingdom, led by Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister, from Australia, from Canada, from Georgia, from Norway. I mean, it was really an avalanche. And amongst the contacts was one from the Ukrainian foreign minister, who I didn't know, Dmytro Kuleba, who had read East-West Street and wrote and said, actually he got someone to phone me, and that person said, we want to run with this idea. That was how it began. It happened within 48 hours. And so then one thing led to another, led largely by Gordon Brown, because it turns out that just as children of former Nazis have fantastic address books, former prime ministers have fantastic address books. And for the next 2 weeks, there were sort of regular, every 2 or 3 days, Zoom calls with these former heads of state from across Europe and other parts of the world. And the issue ran and ran. And now there is a core group of 40 countries that support the creation of a special criminal tribunal for the crime of aggression, but they've got stuck not on whether to create a special court, but what sort of a special court to create. So there's a larger group of countries, but they're smaller countries, led by Ukraine, the Baltics, Poland. I don't know what I can't remember what Romania's position is actually on it, which group they're part of. They want a full international tribunal. And then there's the UK, the US, and France, who are nervous about a full international tribunal because, in a sense rightly, they say, well, if you can create a full international criminal tribunal for one permanent member of the Security Council today, why can't you do it tomorrow in relation to us? And the elephant in the room for Britain and the United States is Iraq, of course. So they sort of want a more lower grade international special tribunal for the crime of aggression, which isn't a full-on international one, but what they call a hybrid, possibly with an international element, seated in The Hague. And right now the negotiations are about building a bridge between those 2 models. So it's pretty interesting. I would never have predicted it would get as far as it does. I sort of now hope that it happens, because I think that there is an important political need for solidarity amongst that core group of countries, and the division between them basically only helps one side. And right now I think it's a very difficult moment for Ukraine militarily, politically, and they've got the law on their side. And so I'm hoping that there'll be a sort of coming together now to try to find a compromise which everyone can live with. But if you had asked me the day the article came out on the 26th of February 2022, could I imagine that there would be a special criminal tribunal, I would have said it's less than 0.00001%. So it's come a long way. It's quite interesting.